Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for being with us today. My name is Bob Charlet, and I'm president and publisher of the Houston Business Journal. We've assembled a truly expert panel today for a discussion that's impacting all aspects of life and work titled, What's Next for Urban America? A look at how COVID-19 has impacted our society and our cities. The journals have worked with our moderator, Joel Kotkin, for many years. And when we began discussion several months ago about HBJ possibly becoming a part of this event, we of course said yes. Those initial discussions were focused on more narrow subjects. Well, we realized very quickly that the COVID pandemic had impacted almost all aspects of life and work, and we knew we needed a much deeper and richer discussion to address those issues. We hope you'll hear some important perspectives from our panel today. I'm very proud to report that HBJ turns 50 years old this year, and we've never been healthier. With now close to 1 million monthly readers across all of our platforms, including a dedicated reporter committed to covering diversity business. While we're primarily a business news organization, we're also a platform for hosting meaningful discussions on important issues, and we support those entities that engage in meaningful discussions as well. Thanks again for being with us today. And now I'm going to turn it over to Charles Blaine, president of Urban Reform Institute.
Thanks, Bob. Appreciate it. And I just want to thank everybody for coming today, both the panelists and the attendees. I'm excited for this discussion. It's something that Joel and Wendell and Tori, who's also with us in the attendee section, we've been talking about it for a while. For those who don't know, Urban Reform Institute is a 501c3, and we promote approaches that enable cities to drive opportunity for the bulk of their citizens. So the future of cities in the midst of the pandemic and beyond the pandemic is something we're really interested in. I don't want to take up too much time before we get started, but I do want to make sure to thank the sponsors and partners of today's program. Obviously, the Houston Business Journal, thanks so much to Bob and your team over there. Prairie View A&M's Master of Community Development Program, thank you to them, and Tiffany for your help with that, and the Howard Hughes Corporation, who sponsored today's program as well. And for those who don't know, the Howard Hughes Corporation manages and develops commercial, residential, and mixed-use real estate throughout the United States, and operates properties and development opportunities, including the Seaport in New York, Columbia, Maryland, the Woodlands Hills, and Bridgeland, all here in Greater Houston. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joel. And as a note for attendees, you guys can submit questions in the chat box. We'll try to work them into the conversation. If we're unable to do that, we'll make sure to get them in at the end. So feel free to do that throughout the course of the conversation. But Joel is moderating our panel today, and Joel is the executive director of Urban Reform Institute, and he also serves as presidential fellow in urban futures at Chapman University in Orange, California. He's also executive editor of the widely read website newgeography.com and writes the weekly New Geographer column for Forbes.com, and is a regular contributor to the Daily Beast and Real Clear Politics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Joel.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. I'm just going to talk quickly about what we're going to try to deal with, which is, where does the urban economy go, urban housing go after we get into this, after we get out of the pandemic. We may be in an endemic. I think we're going to live with this for a long time, but how do we respond? What's going to happen? This is a big question with literally trillions of dollars at stake. So we have a really great panel. Wendell Cox, who I've worked with for many years, worked at the Los Angeles County Transportation Commission. He has to admit that he was one of the people behind the metro rail that we got in, or the metro system we got in LA, which has been a bit of a failure, but it's not his fault. But he's been on top of these issues for a long time. And unlike many urban pundits, he changes as the data comes in. He's very data driven, and he's also a senior fellow at URI. And then we're going to ask Andrew Siegel. Andrew, I know even longer than I've known Wendell. Andrew actually is probably, as much as anyone, the one who got me turned on to Houston, maybe because I figure that a guy from Montreal grew up in New York and liked the place. Maybe it had something going for it. He's a chairman of Boxer Property, if you've seen the 777 Rent, you know, he's the one you can blame. But he's gone into so many different industries. Every time I see him, it's something different. Resort hotels, retail centers, collaborative workspace. And he's also become a real player in the software market. You know, your typical sort of Houston entrepreneurial story, which many people don't know about, but is a real player. Luis Torres, I've also known for a while. He's at the real estate center at Texas A&M. They study the Texas economy. So Wendell and Andrew will really deal with the sort of big picture national. Luis will be our expert on what's actually happening in Texas and all the markets in Texas. And then Tiffany, who's a member of the Houston City Council, will really then sort of draw it down to what is actually happening in Houston itself. Is Houston going to be a beneficiary of these changes, or is Houston going to suffer? How does it play? I think obviously that's something the audience is interested in. So what I'd like to do is just start off. Wendell is sort of the guy who looks at the numbers on a national and international basis. So Wendell, you want to share your screen? And
will do. Oh, here we are. Sorry. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. What I basically said, we're going to cover sort of the international and national level. I'm calling the presentation that the people will decide. Where will we work and live? And this is a picture of Fifth Avenue in New York, 49th Street. You see a block north is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And this is March 22, which was Tuesday. I can tell you that in 2019, it didn't look anything like this. And this is what we have seen in central business districts, in especially cities with huge transit market shares, frankly, around the world. But in any event, let's see if I can get this going here. Let's see. I can't seem to, oh, here we are, okay. First of all, let's talk about what has happened in our cities around the country, and I should say in Texas and the nation in terms of travel during the pandemic. You can see that the nation is the darker blue, Texas is the lighter blue. You can see that travel on a daily basis to workplaces, and this is as of last week, mind you, the Google mobility reports, travel is down 24% to work sites. That doesn't include working at home, by the way, and 26% in Texas. So it's pretty close to the national level. Notice groceries and pharmacies, we're pretty much doing around the country what we did before. Maybe we're not going to as many places, but we're making as many trips. And on residences, virtually the same situation. So that's where we are now. Now, meanwhile, of course, I can tell you that back during the time that the central business districts in the largest cities were really impacted, they were down 80, 90%. So we're recovering as the economy opens up. Here's what we were faced with, though, however, beginning with like March of 2020. Notice how the unemployment rate absolutely skyrockets, but then it drops very substantially. And one of my theses is that remote work largely saved this country from a depression. The economic decline that occurred in March and April of 2020 was virtually really the worst we ever saw in a 2-month period, but it recovered very quickly. There were still some real problems, but we could have been a whole lot worse off. Now, COVID is what I like to call the overcrowding virus. Exposure density is the issue. Exposure density is proximity and duration of exposure. For example, to people sneezing, coughing, etc. The big problems are enclosed in insufficiently ventilated spaces, such as elevators, transit, crowded offices, crowded housing. Now, social distancing saves us in all of these except for crowded housing. As a matter of fact, social distancing, when you think about closing down Manhattan and New York, and a whole bunch of people are now home in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens, weren't before, the housing has become more crowded. So household density, according to a Columbia study, is really the defining category, the strongest COVID-19 predictor. So overcrowded housing is something we really need to be aware of. Now, what's happened around the world, these are OECD data, and this is from April and May of 2020. 50% of all employees, including those who were out of work due to layoffs, were working at home at that point. Now that compares to 5% normally. So it's a big deal. It's happening around the world at this point. Remote work or hybrid work. So that has been a huge change. Now, one of the things that's happened as a result of this, and this is work, by the way, that you at Texas A&M and you in the broader Houston area can be very proud of, because A&M has been the go-to place for traffic congestion data since 1982. You can see at the right side of the diagram that traffic congestion absolutely died. Now, I'm sorry I didn't get Houston on this, but you can see LA, which has had the worst traffic congestion in the country, except for a couple of years that it was Houston in the late 80s. And you can see that traffic congestion has really dropped, and that's been very good for greenhouse gas emissions and all sorts of things. Now, think about remote work and hybrid work. Now, hybrid work is where you don't work all the time at one place. Maybe you go to work 3 days a week, 1 day a week, 1 day a month. There have been all sorts of examples of companies that have adopted this. Now, I just read in the Montreal Gazette this morning, a local developer in Montreal saying that working at home was sort of a passing fancy and he didn't expect anything to change. Well, let me show you what has happened just with a couple of examples. And this has happened because of people, not because these companies necessarily were ahead of the curve. It's because they saw what was going on in the market and realized they had to respond. PricewaterhouseCoopers announced a week ago that if you work for us, you can live anywhere. Apple suffered pushback, for example, when they told their employees, you're going to have to work 3 days a week. 3 days a week, that's radical. I mean, most people, 95% of the people in this country, maybe a bit more than that, worked 5 days a week 2 years ago. And now Apple is saying you only have to work 3 days a week, but that wasn't good enough. And there's been some considerable pushback from Apple employees on that. But other companies, and there are a whole, we don't have time to go through them all, but it's happening all over. You got Google, Target, Microsoft, and many others. Now, I want to show you what's happened in cities. Now, by cities, there is no more prominent city in the United States or no greater international city, probably even greater than London, than New York City and the New York metropolitan area. And here's what's happened as of as of the 8th, which I think was Friday, maybe it was Saturday. No, not Saturday. You can see that work trips continue to be down 45% in Manhattan. The reason I use Manhattan is because the data is real good and it doesn't get any more impressive than Manhattan. You go to Bergen County across the river, down 33%. Nassau County on the other side of Queens, 29%. Union County, which is up near Newark, it's not Newark, but near Newark, down 24%. Far outer Suffolk County at the end of Long Island, down 22%. And if you go to the most southerly county of the New York metropolitan area, which is so far south that you can just about walk to Atlantic City, down 20%. New York City lost 500,000 jobs last year. Office buildings averaged 85% empty, and commuter rail patronage at its lower level dropped 90%. Now, this has been the story in the 7 largest downtowns, which, by the way, does not include Houston, because these are the ones that have a transit market share of 40% or more. And what's happened is, even though some of these are coming back better now, transit has been doing very poorly. And it's largely because people are concerned, as Bloom at Stanford has put it, about a residual fear of infection. But proximity to work has become incredibly less important. Now let's talk about the post-pandemic future. And this is my slide that sort of talks about some very tenuous predictions. First of all, the residual fear of infection is very real. People don't want to be in crowded spaces. And my view is, and I think a lot of people agree with this, there are going to be future pandemics. In fact, as I think Joel sort of indicated, we may never get out of this pandemic. The politicians, some of them anyway, and the media seems to be having such fun with it. But what are the likely trends? Well, I would suggest, obviously, much more remote and hybrid work. We're going to see that all over the place. Bloom at Stanford, who has looked at this probably more than anybody, says 20 to 25%. There is a renewed interest in detached housing, more space in the house and more space in the yards. And that's especially so for millennials, according to a recent National Association of Realtors survey, who are now raising kids. They want space. And finally, it is possible, and this will take longer. We're not going to be looking at radical changes in where we live. That takes time. But it is possible, and we're already seeing from the data, migration from the highest cost urban cores, places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York, to areas with a lower cost of living. Now, that doesn't mean that people in New York are all moving to, say, Des Moines or anything like that, because in fact, it appears the biggest move is within metropolitan areas. For example, if you happen to be someone who lives in New London or New Haven, Connecticut, and you work in Midtown Manhattan, you go to Grand Central Station every day. Now, all of a sudden, you might realize that, you could just go in there once a week or once a month and take the train in that way. So moving to the edge of the metropolitan area is happening more, but there's also going to continue to be movement within metros. And that's going to be especially true in Texas, where you have already had an exodus of just about everybody, it seems to me anyway, that does business outside California to either Dallas, Houston, or Austin. But the bottom line is this is not something that's going to be decided by government. It's not something that's going to be decided by planners. People will decide because you are talking about the health of their families. Thank you very much.
Great. Right, if we could take the screen or the PowerPoints off, I'd like to, I think what Wendell's talked about, of course, is very important in terms of what the numbers are. Andrew, you travel all over the world and all over the country throughout this entire procedure with the pandemic. What are you seeing, and how do you think what businesses are both hurt more or help more? And where do you think this is going?
Well, I would say a few things. Is that first of all, the whole issue with COVID has turned into commute, as far as I could tell, because nobody seems to have a problem going to the Astros games. The restaurants are packed, social events packed, but when you ask someone to get on a train, they don't feel comfortable. So I understand that. The other thing that's very interesting is, and that kind of comes with it, is when you have an urban core where people are leaving a car behind to ride public transportation, it's virtually impossible to get them to do it. So the more urban you are, where it requires public transportation, and the larger the company, the less utilization of the workplace. Smaller, suburban, are virtually normal at this point, and we've got stuff kind of around the country. So I think that's a big a big shift that we've got to be aware of.
Andrew, can you talk a little bit about the suburban office space that you've been developing?
Yeah, so the theory, my theory, and we have software that measures productivity and engagement, in a very granular form, is that working from home is it just diminishes the amount of work that people do. I mean, they just literally, nobody, myself included, has the discipline to concentrate on work the way that we do in the office. So, I think that what's going to happen is people are going to have to go to an office. It may not be the office. So if I'm Google and I have a giant campus in the middle of Manhattan, and 80% of the people are arriving from outside of the island every day, I may disperse the offices. I may put one in Connecticut, one in New Jersey, one on Long Island, and allow people to go to a center. But Wendell said something very interesting. He used the words proximity and exposure. And while proximity and exposure lead to COVID, it also leads to collaboration and to inventiveness. Like, there's a reason why so much is coming out of these dense urban environments, so much creativity, so many new businesses. So I think we need to put people together. We're also kind of coasting. I could take an organization that's worked together for years and disperse them, and day one, nothing happens. But wait till you start trying to onboard people. As we try and onboard people into remote positions, we're gonna really have a lost generation.
Well, I think, this is something that I think, we're going to have to cope with. And I agree. And Rich Florin and I, and the stuff that we've been doing together, we've been finding out that to a large extent, the younger employees are the ones who most need the office. I think the older you get, you maybe don't have to go 5 days a week. But I think for the younger people who, want to meet other people and need to be mentored, I think it's a very different thing. So we'll see how that shakes out. Now, Luis, how has Texas fared in this, and what do you see happening in Texas in terms of suburbs, exurbs, which regions?
Yeah, the Texas economy, it's relatively it's fared well. If you look at by MSA comparisons of 4 major MSAs, there's some differences, of course, because of the industry mix. So right now, I can tell you that Austin has recovered all of its jobs due to the pandemic. So Austin is back to pre-COVID levels. Dallas-Fort Worth is almost there. San Antonio. The ones not doing that well is Houston. But the reason for that is because of the industry mix and the importance of the oil industry. I know Houston is more diversified. It doesn't depend 100%. We saw it during the oil bust in 2014, right? The economy didn't go into recession. Basically, it didn't grow, but it didn't go into recession like in the 1980s. But still, right now, you see the performance of the jobs coming back is not completely back. Now, regarding other issues, I totally agree with Andrew and with Wendell said also earlier that the pandemic basically accelerated trends that were already prevalent before that, right? Working from home was there, right? Still already existed, right? But due to the pandemic, we actually started using it, right? So one of the this industries or sectors that has done really well during the pandemic, of course, we see it in the news every day, is the housing market, right? The housing market is going, right now, it's extraordinary to think about it that during the pandemic and during a recession, right, we see such a strong housing market with historical low months of inventory, and it's benefited. Why? Because Andrew mentioned it, because of that, now the hybrid model of working from home, right? That increased the preferences of purchasing a home, right? And if you add the historical low mortgage rates, if you look at who was hurt by the pandemic, also, right? Homeowners or future homeowners weren't affected by the pandemic. Why was that? Because they work in industries that can socially distance, right? If you look at the demographics of homeowners, you'll find right away that they're more educated, a little bit older, education, they earn higher incomes. So that benefited the housing market. And if you add the new preference of trying to buy, of wanting to have a bigger house where I can work from home, right? That allowed the housing market to do well. So the housing market overall in Texas is doing extraordinarily well as the nation, right? Housing prices are going at a very high rate. What we did notice, that I think right now what's happening with the pandemic frenzy in the housing market, is that it's kind of slowing down. I think it's reached a peak. If you look at repeat sales index, they reached a peak. If you look at the months of inventory, although they're still low, right? They kind of reached a trough. Also, days on market, low, but reach a top. And also permits, peak, kind of slowing down. So you kind of see that the housing market, although it's strong, demand is still strong, that frenzy has kind of lost the high rate of growth that we saw, right?
One quick question is, what's the impact of the higher prices on lumber and the supply chain? Like, my older daughter works at Home Depot, and she keeps telling me, well, you wouldn't believe how much this costs, or we can't get that. Is that one of the reasons for the lack of permits or slowdown, or?
No, so definitely, that's one of the reasons why we've seen such high home prices, right? Home builders, of course, they have to make a profit, right? So we see that they first was the lumber issue, right? I know it actually went down, but now we have they're facing other issues with other material costs. So definitely that's been a headwind for new home construction, right? The cost of material, the cost of high materials that we've seen during the pandemic, and that's one of the issues of the pandemic, right? The supply issue, and I think the housing market, the real estate market, has also been affected by the supply chain issues that we've seen all around the economy now.
So then now to turn to Tiffany, you actually have to deal with these things, not from a pundit's point of view or an economist or even a business person's, but as a member of the city council, and obviously also with your relationship with Prairie View. Where do you see this affecting Houston, and what steps do you think Houston's going to have to take if it wants to keep up? Because as Luis said, it is sort of slipping a little bit behind the other Texas markets.
Sure. So really good question. And I do want to acknowledge Wendell's last point about how the people will decide. And I think that it can attribute directly to the housing market. So in 2020, families and individuals made decisions about, do I live in the city or do I move to Katy? Do I finally, relocate my family and go to Sugar Land? This is the right time to leave. I can choose a different school system. And even I now have flexibility with my employer to do these things, because at that time it was indefinite. So I think we have to acknowledge how that influenced the market. And then also what's influencing the market is the fact that, Texas, we have some of the best values, and you have investors coming from all over the state, all over the country, California, purchasing these properties. So when we really look at the statistics, we have to interrogate and challenge, is this just investor purchases, or are we actually growing our home ownership footprint in the city, which is really, really important when we look at like long-term funding of the city and our school districts and other pieces. And there was something else you mentioned before I really answer your real question. We talked about big box economy and our corporations and those frameworks, but what COVID really forced, it forced this new economy. And you had this whole entire generation of young people that are literally running businesses from their phone. They're literally becoming influencers on platforms, social media, digital content, and they're redefining what mentorship is, right? They're getting mentorship because they watch someone on the internet, they have access to someone on YouTube where previously you wouldn't be able to access this type of content or this thought leadership. And so I think what's happening, not just in the workplace, but we're redefining what was traditional for me, right? Being in the office, staff meetings, having the opportunity to engage with senior leadership and mature in your field. Because of technology, that's opened some things up. So I think we'll start seeing some indicators from that and how that influences our market and what we look and how that impacts commercial development. So from a local perspective, yes, we are dealing with that. I am happy to report that our sales tax is through the roof in the city, which means, to Andrew's point, people are out. I don't know what restaurant you've been in the city, but it's full. Houston's open. And so it's to his very point, it's about the commute. And I think people are asking questions around quality of life and thinking about, okay, am I even willing to accept the job if I have to go in more than 3 days? These are real conversations that my peers, they're having, people in my network where they're making decisions around that. But what we want to do in the city is also think about those who don't have those options to make those decisions. And so there's an economy that was disrupted during COVID, our food service economy, our entertainment economy, our creative economy. So locally, we have used CARES dollars, some of our ARPA funds, American Resource Funds, to really supplement, to make sure, like you said, the oil and gas, we didn't, it's a big deal in the economy, but it didn't end us, because we do have a strong creative economy. We do have a strong entertainment economy, and we had to underscore that where they didn't necessarily have the same safety net. So we've been looking at how do we keep them stable, because we hope and anticipate there's a day where all of our theaters will be back open. The Toyota Center, they're doing full capacity, the NRG. So once we get those things moving, those individuals will contribute to our economy. So for us, from a budgetary standpoint, how we look at priorities in terms of investing from a housing perspective, it's very accurate. More dense environments in the city had higher COVID positivity rates. I had 3 out of the top 10 zip codes because I represent communities that are highly dense. So when we're looking at our aggressive multifamily portfolio in the city, we have to think about those things because that showed us that families were moving in with each other. You had different generations in the home. And so how do we accommodate that with, schools? Students needed dedicated space to learn and didn't have that in an apartment complex. They didn't have those opportunities. So we're thinking more creatively about our housing portfolio, but we're also looking at all the economies that are not attached to our big box traditional, the big boys that come into the city that really help secure the economic framework of the city of Houston. And that's an ongoing conversation. We receive proposals every week. Everyone wants support. Everyone wants to be the priority. And with limited funds, we're often stretched to make those decisions.
So let me just open this up to the panel. What do we do to meet this crisis? I mean, the predominant planning mentality, and Wendell, I hope that maybe you could join us as well, that has been densify. Now, if we know that we're supposed to be doing something different, what can a community do to help promote a more healthy living environment?
I think we're going to have to realize that our dense urban lifestyle is going to be gone for 30 years. Like the pendulum is swinging. We need to call downtown a suburb of the Galleria in order to get anyone to move there at this point.
Yeah, Andrew, I think I generally agree with you. We need to have faith in people. The people that have decided they're going to move out to some new place that is less dense, and it's not density that's the problem, it's overcrowding that's the problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can look at very dense neighborhoods of New York that are high income neighborhoods, no COVID problem at all. But the fact is, people make their own decisions. They have no problem. They do not need government to help them make that decision. And as a result of that, I think you're going to see, a lot of this happen without any intervention. The key is to have government not get in the way.
Except for Tiffany's enthusiasm, we actually do need that part. I want anyone who looks at social media as mentoring. I want you to leave the city.
It's a new model, and it's a whole new world, and we have to account for different platforms and the forms of different things to show up. And I mean, we literally have people, because of COVID, leaving their 9 to 5, creating a whole new business, and hiring people because they said, I can do it, right? And technology has been that bridge for that. But then also on the other side, technology has created a gap to accessing resources because we limited everyone. You couldn't even come to City Hall chambers until recently. And so after a year, so when you think about, and this is an assignment I recently gave my students, I'm a faculty member at Prairie View and I teach community development politics. They had to choose a city, but then, go to public session, identify a council committee, schedule time with the elected official. And there was so many barriers to do so because it was only technology. So they had to imagine, what if you were the 65-year-old plus or disabled, or public transportation was your primary, you couldn't access it. And oftentimes those individuals were not able to benefit from the resources the city had because they didn't have access. So that's some of the work that we have to undo, and we've been really intentional around it. But yes, I think it's safe to say y'all are a boomer generation. Yes, to the boomer generation, there's a whole world on the internet and people are gaining a lot of skills.
I think the phrase is okay, boomer.
Well, actually, I think I might be the only one who's actually a boomer. I think Andrew's sort of quasi-Xer, and Wendell is beyond boomer. So, Luis, you're probably an Xer.
Yes.
I'm an Xer. I'm on the bottom X. Mm-hmm.
But so the question is, okay, now we know that COVID hit poor areas that have crowded housing. What can we do about it? I mean, in California, we obviously have a little bit of a housing problem, and but it costs $600,000 to build a one-bedroom apartment. I don't know how that works. So for the four of you, how do we deal with this problem, given that it's not just an economic problem, it's also a health problem?
There is the crucial thing that no one in public policy, except I'm sure for Tiffany, seriously, understands is you've got to keep housing affordability under control. Because you think about when are you eligible for housing subsidies? Well, one of the criteria is when you have to pay more than 30% of your income into housing costs. Well, how do you have that happen? Well, you have that happen because the market prices are too high. And you go to places like California or Portland or Seattle or Denver or Miami, where they have done these terrible things to force house prices up and created an unaffordable housing problem that's unbelievable. I mean, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, suggested that they needed to build 3.5 million houses. Now, let me tell you, they are building affordable houses at $600,000 per copy. $600,000. You can build an affordable house for less than $100,000 in some communities. So the basic point is you've got to keep housing under control, and that's being done in Texas.
Yeah, I think that in other places, and not Houston, I'm excluding Houston, is that I see housing as Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where the government basically makes the child sick and then comes to the aid for great sympathy, is that they make houses in California very, very, very expensive and hard to build, and then they rush in to subsidize them. And there's a reason why people are flooding into Houston and Texas, because Tiffany's not doing that. You can actually build things here. I realize it's expensive.
You can build.
We're housing 120,000 new people a year. It's a credit to the government.
And so specifically in Houston in January, we voted to accept $124 million TERS bond transaction to support single family home development to build 2,000 homes within the city proper, affordable homes. So we're talking 80% AMI, 50-60% AMI for individuals that otherwise would be priced out of any market. And so that application for developers in the city has been open, and we've been encouraging them to apply because we want to make sure, to your very point, that affordability remains. And also with our multifamily, we have looked at deals that needed to be refinanced so we can have longer affordability through the life of the project. Because the reality is, I remember my very first apartment, I think I paid $500. And I thought I was, doing something. Probably today, that same apartment is closer to $1,200, right? And so when wages are not going up or if certain economies, people are, food service, they're not doing that type of money, it's very difficult to keep up, especially if you don't have the supply. You don't have the supply. So I know from a local level, we're being really intentional about the affordability and making sure that those 50, 60, and 80% AMI, that they have an opportunity to stay in high opportunity areas, particularly with our single family initiative that we should finish by 2023.
Yeah, let me add on rent too, because especially a lot of younger people are rightly concerned about how high rents are. Believe it or not, rents haven't even begun to go up anything like house prices have gone up in a place like California or Oregon. But, rents are largely determined by market prices of owned housing. A lot of people don't realize this. There's like a 0.9 correlation, if you look at the major metropolitan areas, between house values and median gross rents. Another reason why we need to keep the housing market under control.
By the way, Gavin Newsom won Texas Realtor of the Year.
He had to.
But going back to Wendell's point, I think the importance of regulation also plays a role going forward, right? Always we think about in Texas, always the comment is with all the new Texans coming in from California and other places of the rest of the nation, is that going to create a change in our way of looking at regulation, right? I think that's one thing that's always gives us that comparative advantage to think about going forward, right? I think that would definitely play a role in the future. No?
So now one of the questions that we've been getting is obviously there's a movement to the big metros, and as Wendell said, the biggest move has been from the inner part of the big metros to outer. What about smaller communities? Andrew, do you see any smaller communities taking advantage of this? Wendell, I know there's been some movement to smaller cities, and is that taking place in Texas?
Well, let me tell you about what's going on in the Seattle area. And just a couple of days ago, the New York Times had an article on how well Seattle was doing. And frankly, it looked to me like the reporter was trying to basically say, hey, you know what? City of Seattle is doing fine. Everything that was in the article was about the suburbs, except for a couple of 12-story buildings that were leased by Apple that they claimed happened in the pandemic, but happened before the pandemic. Well, what's happened, according to the Wall Street Journal review of post office change of address forms, is that King County, which is where Seattle is, has had a huge outflow of people. And that's unusual because they've been actually gaining as people leave San Francisco to make profits on their house moving to Seattle. What has happened in the Seattle area is you go to areas that are 100 to 150 miles away, and they have done very well. So we're seeing that, and that same study, and if anybody's interested, I can give a link to it. They actually have a nice map that shows you county by county in-migration and out-migration based upon this data. And around the country, you can see this same dynamic in many places.
In regard to Texas, just to add something,
Yeah, please.
We also track rural land prices here at the center, and it's extraordinary to see that rural land prices of resident at a very high rate also.
Yeah.
So I think it's the whole real estate market. The single-family homes, rural land prices also have increased at a very, very high rate here in the state of Texas.
And let me add this, on the way to jump on the call, I was talking to a girlfriend, and she let me know that, she had purchased a home in Spring, Texas. Now, this is your quintessential city girl, right? Would never leave the city limits, the Beltway. Oh my God, what? And I was like, you moved to Spring, Texas. What in the world? But that's what you're seeing. People are making the choice. This is why there's so much growth south of Houston, beyond Pearland, Manville. You have Rose Sharon, these communities, Richmond, Fulshire. I remember when Fulshire was just a country town. And now that's the bedroom community that everyone wants to move to. Even when you look at our census numbers and the redistricting maps that are proposed in Texas, there's a new congressional map, a new congressional seat that's being proposed west in the city because of those growth patterns. And so you have to acknowledge the fact that there is growth and people are no longer romanticized about living inside the city core. They're looking at different options because of amenities, affordability, and then the quality of life, which, after COVID, I think everyone's asking the question about their quality of life and how they choose to, participate in that. And I think that's definitely an influencer.
Andrew, are there any small towns in Texas or elsewhere that may be attractive for your suburban small scale offices?
Well, I think we're talking about two kinds of small towns. So we're talking about a suburb. If you get into a real small town, it's a mirage. I'm sure that we could send a reporter out to find some person from Price Waterhouse who's living in Bastrop or one of these little Texas cities, or maybe Marfa, but it's just not happening. Like, in other words, it's zero compared to what is going on in the suburbs. And they used to be small towns, but Spring is really, you run into, here's my test. If you run into someone in another country or another state and say, where are you from? The person in Spring is going to go, Houston.
Houston.
That's right. And then you're going to go, where in Houston? Then they get to Spring. But somebody in Falfurrias, Texas, in the middle of nowhere is not going to say Houston. So I think that there's going to be a return to offices. We're about to have an avalanche of litigation that's going to do it. It doesn't matter what people want, is that we have more and more people are being classified as hourly employees, more and more people. And if you send them an email at 7 a.m. and another one at 7 p.m., you're going to have a class action on your hands, and the general counsel and the HR department are going to go everybody back to an office. And again, I don't think I'm going to be able to get them to pile into, ride the metro to Allen Center, but I'm certainly going to be able to get them to go to the Woodlands or a place where they could bring their car. And companies are not going to be able to compete with a distributed workforce.
Yep.
It's like, if it's 10 or 15% less productive, they are out of business. It doesn't exist. But one other thing I just want to say about dealing with the urban issues is we have got to stop talking about jobs. Can't hire anyone. We cannot hire people. Like, in other words, there are no lost jobs. You cannot hire entry-level workers. You can't hire mid-level workers. You can't hire professionals. It's acute. And I'm not talking about minimum wage either. Everyone's past that. No one's no one's even trying to hire anyone at minimum wage right now. It's not that, it's that nobody is answering the ads.
Well, obviously, that's a big change. So it really is, you got to go to where people want to live if you want to get employees, it would seem to me.
No, you can't hire people in Detroit, and you can't hire people in Brentwood, and you can't hire people in Los Angeles. You can't hire people in Phoenix. You can't hire people in Florida. Like, there is not a place with an available workforce, as far as I could tell, in the United States.
Well, but let's say if Tori Gaddis, one of our fellows, asked the question, and particularly for you, Tiffany, let's just say the movement is, like David Wolf said to me, the future in Houston's Waller County. That's where he thinks the growth is going to take place. How does the city of Houston position itself, given this movement of people into the periphery? It's open to everyone, but I know Tori was concerned with what Tiffany might think.
No, you're absolutely right. And as someone that splits her life between Harris County and Waller County, I remember when you could blink and pass and go straight through Waller County. Now it's almost like Georgetown, Texas, and it will be really soon, especially with the proposed rail from College Station down. And so again, I think it's about the diversification of our city economy. And making it a quality of life. Like, when people would, again, have to choose the city of Houston. They would have to choose our school systems and our 12 independent school districts. They would have to choose, the quality of life. There's been an extreme, and particularly after George Floyd, there's been a focus around our complete communities in the city. And the mayor mentioned this is the mayor's initiative. So when we're looking at revitalizing neighborhoods, our parks, all of these amenities that, weren't necessarily on the radar for communities and for people, now they're making decisions based on that in some way, right? So we're looking at competitiveness, not just by jobs and having businesses come here. Of course, we want that, and we will welcome that, and we want to be their headquarters. But also, there's some things within our city that we have to do in order to sustain that, where they can convince their employees when they move here, yes, we want you to stay in the city of Houston and not go to the peripheral areas. So I think growth to the west side in Waller County, it's inevitable, it's happening. I remember when acres were nickels and dimes, and now you can't find your way off of 290 to afford a piece of land. So the growth is happening. They're doing everything that they need to do to make sure that they're competitive as well. But I think we have to have real conversations about how we envision the city, not just in the next 5 years, but in the next 10, 15 years for families, individuals, commerce, and just all of our economies, from the port to our, higher education systems. All of those things are interconnected. And so we have to do that. We can't skip that conversation.
So in a sense, it builds off Wendell's point that it's the people going to decide. And, like, people say to me, well, do you think cities have no role, no future? I said, no, if cities are good places to live,
Yep.
there's going to be a lot of people who are going to want to go there.
Yep.
I mean, Andrew and I both can remember New York before the reduction in crime. And it was, I mean, my memories of high school, walking down the street and looking behind my back. And I was mugged in New York as a kid. And so I know it was scary. When they beat that and crime went down, people said, hey, New York's a great place. No, it's not a great place, maybe if you're a middle-class family with 3 kids, but it's a great place in your 20s. My youngest daughter, you know, is an actress, and, you know, obviously going to New York is something she wants to do. That's still a potential. So what is it that Texas cities are going to have to do to make themselves attractive in this sort of all of a sudden anything goes kind of market, particularly given the labor shortage?
Isn't it really a question of what do we not do?
What do we not
You know,
do?
in other words, we have massive influx now. There's massive influx. There's no unemployment. Like, we're not trying to get companies to come here to hire our unemployed people. I can't hire people here. I don't want another company competing with me. So all we have to do is stay out of the way, and then do the things that Tiffany was talking about, is make sure that the things that the government is responsible for, the parks, the schools,
Pick up our trash.
there's tons of them. Pick up the trash, fix the potholes, but like otherwise just stand back. I mean, we're not competing with Waller. It doesn't matter. There's enough people for everybody.
Sure.
You know, why would we compete with Waller County when Gavin Newsom is running our tourism bureau?
And let me
next
add
time
this, let me add this, Joel. So early 2020, when we were all sent home, we had such an increase in demand in our solid waste because people were home. So the trash and recycle, the demand for those services were through the roof. And mind you, you know, we were still experiencing delays. The demand on our public safety through the roof. And our public works, our infrastructure. People were home and were able to pay attention to that pothole, and they were able to pay attention to that street that they normally would just drive over and get to work and go on about their business, but they were focused on that. And because of that, we've really been able to invest a lot and really focus on our core services and making sure that those core, you know, services are available, instituting the technology with solid waste, where we now can track our trucks, and we know where they're going and we know those routes. So, I mean, to that very point, where, you know, it forced us as a city to advance and adopt technologies to become more efficient in our very core job.
Yeah, and in addition to that, you know, education also, good schools, better schools, right? And that'll attract people, like security, all the amenities that's government, the local government should provide, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yes.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Charles for the last question, and then anyway, it's been really a fascinating discussion, and even if we don't all agree, hopefully it elucidated some of the main points. So Charles, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to throw out 2 questions really fast, and we don't have too much time. The first one that we got was, what role does the state have in ensuring housing affordability? As it's benefited from all the folks moving here, what role should the state play in making sure of that? And then the other question that we got was kind of directed to Tiffany, was, as the growth moves out into Waller County, what are the challenges that institutions in that area have to face, such as Prairie View A&M, which is obviously deeply rooted in the community there, but may not have received the funding in the past and the attention in the past that it might in the future? What challenges do they face? And so whoever wants to tackle whichever question first, I know that both of those were asked. So state ensuring housing affordability and challenges for institutions in the suburbs and exurbs.
Let me go quickly at the state, because you have a couple of things in the state of Texas that are crucial and must not be changed. One, in my view anyway, is the fact that counties don't have zoning authority. And that has made it possible for the market to develop. And the reason we want the market to develop is we want a housing market that serves people, not a housing market that makes our city pretty. You know, we're interested in people and their affluence. And the second thing is the municipal utility districts. These municipal utility districts, and I think you may have 1,500 of them in the Houston metropolitan area, have done just an incredible job of delivering new houses sustainably and so on. And that's at the same time, I'm really heartened to hear what Tiffany is talking about with respect to city programs to try to attract people into single family homes and into residing in the city. And that's great.
I think
So for
that
the point, oh, go ahead,
accentuates-
Andrew. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, is you just talked about two things that the government should not do, which is build the utilities themselves, the infrastructure through the mud districts, which I agree is a very elegant solution, and don't give out zoning. Don't give out zoning authority if you want a city to grow dynamically and quickly.
So I am definitely not the president of our university, but I have to acknowledge Dr. Ruth Simmons and the county executive, Trey Duyon. Trey Duyon in Waller has served on our university strategic plan and is a great partner for the institution. So Prairie View is the largest employer in Waller County. And so as it changes, we're looking at how our not academic lines, but just how we create service lines to reach out to the community. We are an 1890 institution, which is a land grant institution. Texas has 254 counties. We have a footprint in 35 of those counties. And so we're basically taking our resources off the university land and going into the community around economic development, agriculture, and other tools. And then as we advance around our STEM and other things, we collaborate. So there are a variety of partnerships that come from Waller County and the institution, not just partnering with our elected officials and the corporations and having pathways for students to have jobs, but really looking at what does the county look like, what role does the institution play in the next 15, 20 years with that growth.
I'm just curious, I know we're almost out of time. The one market that seems to behave a little differently in Texas is Austin. Are they doing anything wrong, or is this a model that the rest of Texas doesn't want to adopt?
I love their keep Austin weird. In other words, they put that out front and they own it. And when you try and do something creative there and someone says, no, you just go, keep Austin weird. And then you can do it. That's all you have to say. That's I think it's an inspiration to other cities, because weird means creative.
Anything else, Joel, or was that it?
Well, I think, I just think that what we, maybe it's not keep Texas weird, but keep Texas affordable.
Keep Texas affordable.
Absolutely.
Because
Keep
if you
Texas
guys are
affordable.
gone, there's no place for America to go.
And the reason we like housing affordability is it keeps the cost of living affordable. It is really the cost of living that is the issue.
Right.
Awesome. Well, that's a good note to leave it on. I appreciate you guys for taking the time out for this conversation today. Thanks to all the attendees for joining us and for your questions. Andrew, Wendell, Tiffany, Louise, Bob signed off, but thank you guys so much for participating. We really appreciate it. Obviously, want to thank the sponsors again, Houston Business Journal, Prairie View A&M's School of Community Development, and Howard Hughes Corporation. So thank you all. We appreciate it. And you can find this on our website at urbanreforminstitute.org, or we'll be putting it up on our social media channels as well. So you can find it there.
That's YouTube, Andrew. That's YouTube. That's
I'm going to tell my daughter all she has to do is say I'm getting mentored.
do it online. Yes,
It's on TikTok.
Y'all have a good one. It's good to see y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so
All right.
much. Appreciate
Bye-bye.
it.
Bye.